So let's dig into this group on foundations and philanthropy. And it's really one of the areas that a lot of impact funds look to for the most source of capital because the capital that foundations and philanthropy steward is intended for doing public good. However, a lot of it doesn't seem to be readily available for impact investing. And so we want to explore first where are we today and how we got to where we are today. And how did foundations and philanthropy end up stewarding as much capital as they're stewarding that isn't fully moving into the marketplace, either as grants or as investment? So to understand that, I actually want to turn to a wonderful piece of work done by justice funders called Stifle Generosity. There's a link available to that. It's a website that goes through the history of how we got to where we are, stifling the generosity of capital that's meant to serve the public good. I want to highlight it here. They do a better job of it than I could, but I think bringing some of the narrative forward would be useful. And it really starts going back to 1913 with the Revenue Act of 1913 that had two very meaningful consequences. The first is that it was the first income tax mandate on the highest incomes in the country. And when I say mandate, it was 1% to 6% affecting people with more than $200,000 in income, which at the time wasn't very much, meaning this income tax affected about 4% of the population. So it did not have a big material effect, but it was the beginning of an income tax mandate. The second thing that happened in the Revenue Act of 1913 is the creation of a new classification of organizations doing social good that were tax exempt, meaning they are not going to pay any taxes on their activity. So we have the very beginning of this whole charitable industry. Along comes a few years later, the next piece of that, when charitable contributions become tax deductible, right? This is the mechanism already put in place to minimize income tax payments, right? So before that, most public charities are things like passing the plate in church, donating to a soup kitchen. Your charitable giving is motivated by your sense of beneficence and generosity and care. And then with this act is the beginning of a transition to charitable giving as an act of wealth management to reduce tax burdens. And I think that's a really critical thing to understand, right? That instead of charity being this innate sense of care for our fellow community members, it becomes an act of wealth management. What happens is there's less revenue for the commons, right? So when you pay tax, you're putting revenue into the government that's supposed to come back to us in services. And there's more privatization of the commons, our shared concerns, because wealthy individuals are enabled to direct their own solutions to the commons problems. And so this is the notion of privatizing the care of community. So when we get to 1921, we have another degree of privatization of charitable work because gifts can now be made for the use of charities and not just to charities. That means you can create a private foundation and make a tax-deductible gift to the private foundation, parking your capital there regardless of how they use it in the world, right? And it'll take another nearly 50 years before there are any regulations that require private foundations to spend that money on charitable purpose, which means these assets, right? Every time I make a tax-deductible gift to a private foundation, those assets can just grow. They can accrue interest and grow, and they don't have to be spent on anything that is in the public interest. So in 1931, we have the establishment of the first donor-advised fund. So a DAF is a philanthropic vehicle that's established at a public charity, and it allows a donor to make a charitable contribution in 1 year, for example, take an immediate tax benefit, and then you can recommend the grant from your DAF out into the world whenever you want. You don't have to do it that year. So if you have a year in which you've made an investment and you have a capital gains that year and you want to take the tax deduction, you can go park that money in your DAF, take the tax deduction, and nothing is moving out to charity. There are no payout requirements for a DAF, meaning it can just sit there and accrue interest and grow. It's not subject to public disclosure. And DAF assets have grown tremendously in recent years. So they were $234 billion in 2021, according to the National Philanthropic Trust. And that's about an 8x growth since 2009. So it's an incredibly rapidly growing sector. And we're going to come back to that because it's an area we need to look at further. So then we're still giving advantages to the privatization of philanthropy. And in 1953, corporate philanthropy gets added into the mix. So the private sector can now minimize and avoid paying corporate taxes by doing philanthropy. So we've been advantaging that philanthropy, privatization of philanthropy until the 60s. And it's time for a little course correction, right? And that's the mood, the ethos of the time. And so in 1963, publicly supported charities are distinguished from private foundations. So the goal is that Congress is trying to course correct for an increase in these tax shelters for the elite. So a public charity is something like the American Red Cross or the Salvation Army that raises money from individuals and immediately puts it back out into the world. And of course, they have to operate, versus a private foundation that is not raising money from the public. So then in 1969, private foundations are more fully recognized and regulated. And this is the first time that there's a minimum standard for private foundations to disperse money, meaning they have to do some sort of payout of their assets every year. And in that year, it's 6% adjusted based on investment rates and market yields. So that is the minimum payout. Now, it's a minimum payout. Doesn't mean they couldn't pay out much more, but this becomes a big argument. And we get to the 80s, we've swung back from the 60s, and we're in the 80s and now again advantaging private foundations and corporations. And so the private foundation payout is decreased. People feel that 6% is too much. And from a lot of pressure from foundation executives, it's lowered to 5%. In 1992, you have the Fidelity Charitable Gift Fund created. This has $49.7 billion of assets under management. It's 21% of the total DAF market. So it's a tremendous amount of money sitting in Fidelity DAF accounts that, remember, have no payout requirements and no public disclosure. Right? Most 501c3s, charitable organizations, have a lot of public disclosure. So there's no disclosure. There can be what some people would call dark money. There's something called the Unmasking Fidelity campaign to see how donation capital is moving through Fidelity DAFs. I don't mean to pick on Fidelity only, because it's a lot of the DAFs are under the same circumstance, which is that people can get the tax advantage and that capital just sits and grows and it's not being paid out. And then finally, the last piece we'll get to is the full market value deduction of appreciated stock to private foundations. So that means it's a way for investors to, again, avoid paying capital gains taxes on profits from stock sales. They can donate the stock itself as opposed to donating the cash. And again, less money for the commons because you're removing the capital gains taxes that would have gone to government as revenue has been removed from the commons. So where are we today? Well, in 2021, foundations gave away $90.9 billion of grants, but they're sitting on $1.3 trillion of assets under management. That's foundations in the United States. So here's the question I want to explore. What are foundations doing with all that money?